On a cold, rainy Sunday evening in late autumn in Providence, the woman standing at the iron gate of the brownstone on Atwell's Avenue carried exactly one thing: a cardboard box crushed in at one corner, and the box was empty. Her coat was torn at the shoulder. There was a fresh bruise darkening along her cheekbone under the streetlight. Everyone in Federal Hill lowered their voice walking past that house, and for years, everyone who rang that gate rang it to ask for something, because the man who lived inside could give or take away just about anything in that city. Emilio Santangelo came out into the rain to open the gate, and before he could ask her a single question, she apologized. She said she understood completely if he had changed his mind, that he had hired a decent schoolteacher, and not whatever was standing in front of him now, that she had nothing left to bring into his house, that she would turn around this very minute without a word of blame, and that she was sorry he had to stand out in the rain over something that never should have happened at all. She asked him for nothing. Emilio asked her who had hurt her. Delia Kavanagh looked him straight in the eye and lied, and said she had slipped on the stairs. He looked at her for 3 seconds, then nodded, and never asked again. What Delia could not have known that night was that the man opening the gate for her had been holding a 30-page file on her life for 3 weeks already, that he knew exactly who she owed money to, and that he was letting her walk in anyway. It would take 4 more months, 1 winter storm, and 1 old leather ledger she never should have opened, before she understood why. If tonight's story reached you, leave a like so we know you're sitting here with us. Share it with someone who has convinced themselves they have nothing left to give. And subscribe, because every week another person walks up to a gate with empty hands and turns out to be carrying everything that ever mattered. Emilio hadn't had time to open his mouth to answer when a hinge creaked behind him, and the heavy wooden door of the brownstone opened just wide enough for a small figure to slip through. No one had called her. No one had given her permission to come outside in the rain at that hour. And yet she came down anyway, 1 step at a time, all 7 stone steps leading from the porch to the courtyard, barefoot on the wet stone. And Emilio turned to look at his daughter with the face of a man watching something impossible happen right before his eyes. Sabina Santangelo came down all 7 steps and stopped exactly 1 step away from the strange woman. She didn't look at the cardboard box in Delia's hands. She didn't look at the coat torn at the shoulder. She lifted her face and looked straight into that bruised face. And she looked for a very long time, long enough that Delia had to bend lower until they were eye to eye, the way someone who had taught for 8 years had learned to do without even thinking about it. In the courtyard, there was nothing but the sound of rain striking the lid of the metal trash can by the curb. Then the little girl reached out, slipped her small hand into Delia's, and held on. Not a sound came from her mouth. She simply held Delia's hand, turned, and started walking toward the door. And because her hand was still wrapped around Delia's, Delia had no choice but to follow, and she did, walking past the man who was still standing motionless in the middle of the courtyard, climbing all 7 wet steps, the empty cardboard box slipping from beneath her arm and tumbling down to the wet gravel below without her even realizing it. In the lighted doorway, an older woman was wiping her hands on her apron while saying something unfinished to someone inside the kitchen. And then she saw those 2 hands clasped together coming up over the top step, and the sentence died in the middle of her mouth. Carmela Ruggiero had worked in this house for 20 years. She had held this child before the girl had even learned to sit up. She knew exactly what Sabina did whenever a stranger came into the house, because for 2 years she had done the same thing every single time. She went upstairs and closed her door. Carmela stepped aside to let them pass, and she couldn't say a word. And years later, whenever she told the story of that night, she would always stop at this part for a very long time before continuing. Out in the courtyard, Emilio Santangelo bent down and picked up the cardboard box. Delia had somehow dropped at the foot of the steps, without realizing it. He lifted it, and it was exactly as light as he had known it would be. He stood in the rain a little longer, with the empty box in his hands, looking up at the lighted doorway where his daughter was pulling into their home, a woman whose face no one in the entire city even knew yet. In the 17 years he had lived on Atwell Street, men more powerful than he was had stood waiting at that gate. Men had knelt there. No one had ever entered this way. He climbed the 7 steps, closed the door behind him, and in the foyer he set the cardboard box down on the wooden table where the mail was usually left. Delia was standing in the middle of the foyer, rainwater dripping in trails onto the hardwood floor, her hand still resting inside the child's because she didn't dare pull it away. She opened her mouth, and he knew at once what she was about to say, because he had already heard her say it outside the gate, so he spoke first. He told her he wasn't hiring a suitcase. He said he had 3 applications on his desk, and he had chosen hers not because of her experience, not because of her degree, not because a priest had recommended her, but because of one sentence she had written in it, a sentence he had read 3 times in a single night. He asked whether she remembered what she had written. Delia stood there, soaked through, inside the house that made the entire neighborhood lower its voice whenever people passed by. And she remembered. She had written that she didn't promise to make the child speak. She only promised to sit beside her while she remained silent, for as long as it took. Emilio gave a single nod. He told Carmela to take her upstairs and find her some dry clothes, then added one more sentence before turning away. Dinner was in the oven, and in this house, no one had to ask permission to eat. All that morning, sitting on the wet steps outside an apartment that was no longer hers, Delia Kavanagh had rehearsed a speech over and over again, a speech meant to help a stranger send her away without having to feel guilty about it. She had revised it 4 times until it was concise, easy to hear, gentle enough to make leaving simple. Then she walked into that house and never used a single word of that speech, not one word, for the rest of her life. Around 9 o'clock that night, after Sabina had fallen asleep and the house had gone quiet, Emilio Santangelo called Delia down to the kitchen, and the first thing he did was tell Carmela to stay. The older woman had been about to go up to her room, her apron already removed, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at him without understanding. He simply told her to sit down, that he wanted a 3rd person in the room when he said what he was about to say. And Carmela understood at once, pulled out a chair, sat at the head of the table, and didn't leave that spot until everything was over. Delia sat across from him in the dry clothes Carmela had just found for her, both hands resting on the table, and she noticed that he didn't pour himself anything, didn't offer her food, didn't make a single polite gesture to soften the air between them. He went straight to the point. First, she had a room of her own on the 2nd floor, and that room had a lock on the door, and the only key would be in her possession. No one in this house, including him, had the right to open that door. Second, her wages would be paid weekly, either in cash or by bank transfer, whichever she preferred, and she had the right to walk out through the gate outside at any moment she chose, without notice, without a reason, with no one stopping her and no one following her. He said that more slowly than the 2 things before it, and he looked directly into her eyes as he spoke, as though he knew that somewhere in her mind she had already considered the possibility of the opposite. Third, and this was the part he said most quietly, he wouldn't ask her anything she didn't choose to tell him herself. He wouldn't ask about her past. He wouldn't ask why she had come here carrying an empty box. He wouldn't ask again about the bruise on her face. Not tonight, not next week, not ever, unless she was the one who spoke first. Delia sat very still. In 8 years of teaching and 2 years of living alone, she had signed many kinds of papers, and she had never heard anyone lay out conditions that favored her this much, and that was exactly why she began to feel afraid, because experience had taught her that anything that sounded too good usually carried a price somewhere that hadn't revealed itself yet. Then Emilio continued, and the price revealed itself, except it wasn't what she had expected. He told her that before she accepted the job, she had the right to know whose house she was accepting a job in. He gave her his name, the name she had heard long before she ever came here, the name people in Federal Hill didn't say loudly inside restaurants. He told her he owned the bakery down the street, a construction company, and 3 warehouses by the harbor, and he said those were the things that appeared in the books. He didn't tell her anything more about the things that didn't. He only said that people told many stories about him, that most of them were true, and that she was better off assuming most of them were. Then he told her why there was always a car parked at the end of the street with 2 men sitting inside, that they weren't watching her, that they were there because his daughter slept on the 2nd floor, and that if there ever came a night when she looked out the window and saw that car, she shouldn't be afraid. He said he was telling her these things not to frighten her, but because he didn't want her hearing them from someone else and becoming frightened afterward, and because a woman who came here with nothing in her hands deserved, at the very least, to know what she was walking into before she decided whether to stay. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and fell silent. And Carmela at the head of the table was silent too, and the entire kitchen waited to see what the woman across from him would ask. Delia Kavanagh looked down at her hands for a long time. She didn't ask about the things that weren't in the books. She didn't ask what the 2 men in the car did for a living. She didn't ask about money, didn't ask about hours, didn't ask about days off. She lifted her eyes and asked him one question, and that question was what the little girl liked to eat. Emilio Santangelo opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked toward Carmela, and Carmela lowered her eyes to the tabletop. In that house there were 4 men guarding the gate, a housekeeper who had been there for 20 years, and a father willing to spend any amount of money to buy his daughter anything in the world, and not one of them could answer that question. He sat there for a very long time in the silence of his own kitchen, and then he said, so softly that Carmela had to tilt her head to hear him, that he didn't know. That night, Delia lay awake in the bed inside the room with the lock, and to understand why a 27-year-old woman would sit in another person's kitchen without asking a single question about money, you have to go back 3 years, to a 3rd-floor apartment in Olneyville, and a baby boy named Owen. He was 7 months old when he began struggling to breathe one January night, and Delia carried him in her arms and ran 3 blocks to the emergency room because waiting for a car would have taken longer, and she stayed in that hospital for 19 days. 19 days in the neonatal intensive care unit. She learned the sound of every machine in that room, learned how to read the numbers on the monitors before the nurse could even walk in, learned to wash her hands for exactly 40 seconds, learned how to sleep sitting upright in a plastic chair and still wake instantly at the sound of an alarm. Her husband, Beck Kavanaugh, worked the night shift at the plant, and he stayed with their son during the day, and through those 19 days, the two of them rarely saw each other for more than half an hour at a time. Then, on the 19th day, everything stopped, and they let her hold her son one last time, and Delia Kavanaugh walked out of that hospital with nothing in her hands. 3 weeks later, the bill arrived. After insurance had paid its share, the amount left was $46,000. The hospital had an assistance fund for families like hers, and someone gave her the application packet, and Delia sat at the kitchen table, filling it out in the apartment where the crib was still standing exactly as it had been, because neither of them had dared to put it away. She submitted the application on time. 2 weeks later, it was returned, not because she didn't qualify, but because it was missing an income verification form no one had told her needed to be included. She went and got the form. She submitted everything again, 3 weeks late. And during those 3 weeks, the hospital had sold her son's debt to an outside company, and once it had left the hospital, the assistance fund had nothing to do with it anymore. And someone told her that over the phone in the polite voice of a person who had said the same thing many times already that day. 3 weeks. There was no villain in this story. No one had deliberately tried to hurt anyone. There was only a piece of paper submitted 3 weeks late, and a system doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Beck didn't tell his wife anything for months afterward, and that was the greatest mistake of his life, because what he did instead was try to fix it by himself. He found a company that specialized in buying debts like theirs, and he sat in a small office in Silver Lake and signed a debt restructuring agreement with an interest clause a night shift worker had no real way of fully understanding. He signed it alone. He didn't bring a copy home. He hid it because he thought he could pay it off before his wife ever found out, and because after those 19 days he didn't want her carrying one more thing. By February, the interest had grown larger than his wages, and a man he knew down by the harbor told him there was a place available on a fishing boat headed for Point Judith, 10 days at sea, triple the pay. He took it. He kissed his wife at 4 o'clock in the morning and told her he would be home in 10 days. The boat was called the Mary Doyle, and it never came back. They found a life ring and a name, and that was everything the ocean gave back to Delia Kavanaugh. She was 25 that February, and within 13 months she had stood beside 2 coffins, one very small and one with nothing inside it. Then the paper Beck had signed alone appeared, because papers like that always know how to find the person who is still alive. Delia began paying. She taught 3rd grade at a public school in Olneyville, and every week she paid nearly $400, and she lived on bread and soup, and she took extra hours supervising children after school, and she did that for 2 years without taking a single week off. This is where the story becomes hard to hear. After 2 years, Delia Kavanaugh had paid more than $40,000, and the balance printed on the statement that arrived in her mailbox every month was still more than $38,000. She had worked it out by hand 3 times on sheets of her students' scratch paper, and all 3 times she got the same answer, and all 3 times she thought she must have made a mistake somewhere, because the only other way to understand that number was to accept that 2 years of her life had been poured into a hole with no bottom, and that they would keep disappearing into it until the day she died. She told no one, not the principal, not her co-workers, not the priest. And that night, lying in the locked room of a strange house, after the man who owned it had told her he would never ask a single question about her past, Delia Kavanaugh lay still and stared at the ceiling, and felt something inside her grow lighter, and she wouldn't understand until 4 months later that this was the most costly promise that man had ever made to anyone. One thing has to be made clear, because if it isn't, there will be people who hear this story and wonder why a school teacher with a respectable job would ever let things go this far. And the answer is that at a certain point, Delia Kavanaugh no longer had any choice in the matter. The company holding the paper Beck had signed took the case to civil court. The court entered judgment without her there because she had no lawyer, and the court authorized her wages to be garnished directly. From that point on, the money was taken before it ever reached her account. She no longer got to decide whether to pay more or less in a given month. No longer got to decide whether that week's rent mattered more than that week's debt. They took their share at the source, and she lived on whatever was left. She tried to find a way out. The state's legal aid center put her on a waiting list, and that list was longer than the debt itself. Then one afternoon, a lawyer agreed to meet with her for 20 minutes at no charge, and when he had listened to the whole story, he asked her exactly one question: whether she had kept the original contract. Delia sat in silence. Beck had signed it alone in a small office in Silver Lake, and he hadn't brought a copy home, and the original was in someone else's hands. The lawyer closed his notebook and told her he was sorry, that without paperwork there was nothing to challenge, that she was standing in front of a wall, and on the other side of that wall were people who knew exactly how empty her hands were. He didn't say another cruel word. He only told her the truth, and the truth was cruel enough. 3 months later, she received notice that she had to leave the third-floor apartment in Olneyville. By her final night there, Delia's belongings had been packed into 4 cardboard boxes lined up beside the door, and she sat in the middle of the empty floor with the last $200 she had withdrawn from the bank tucked inside a cloth bag on the table. Guarani. There was one other thing inside that bag, an old tin that had once held cigars, and inside the tin was Owen's baptism ribbon and the only photograph anyone had ever taken of him, a picture from the hospital on the day he was born, because after that no one had thought about taking pictures anymore. Around 9 o'clock that night, someone knocked on the door. The man standing in the hallway said he had come to collect that week's payment, and Delia told him she didn't have it, that her wages had already been garnished, that by tomorrow she wouldn't even have a place to sleep. He didn't argue with her. He stepped across the threshold, looked around the empty room, and took the cloth bag from the table. She lunged forward and tried to pull it back. Her shoulder struck the doorframe, and she dropped hard onto the step outside in the hallway. And when she looked up, the sound of his footsteps had already reached the landing below. She sat there for a while, then stood up and called the police, and she waited on the stairs for 40 minutes. 2 officers came. They were kind. They asked careful questions, and they asked her the man's name. She didn't know it. They asked whether there were hallway cameras in the building. There weren't. They asked whether anyone had seen what happened. It was 9 o'clock on a Saturday night in a building where half the apartments were empty, and no one had opened a door to look. They asked how much money had been taken, and whether she had any proof that she had been carrying that amount. She had a withdrawal receipt, and the receipt proved that she had withdrawn $200, but it didn't prove that those $200 had been inside the bag that was taken. They filed a report. They gave her a piece of paper with a case number on it and told her to keep it, and they said that if she learned anything more, she should call them back. They hadn't done anything wrong. They had done everything a system could do for a woman who didn't know the name of the man who had just taken her belongings. Delia carried that piece of paper upstairs, sat down between the 4 cardboard boxes, and she didn't cry over the $200. She sat there for a very long time thinking about the tin, about the ribbon, about the only photograph in the world with her son's face in it, now sitting in the coat pocket of a man whose face and name she would never know, a man who would open the bag somewhere in the night, take the $200, and throw the rest away like a piece of wrapping paper. And sitting there in the middle of that empty floor that night, Delia Kavanaugh had a thought so calm that later even she would be frightened when she remembered it, that perhaps the world had decided a long time ago that she wasn't allowed to keep anything, and perhaps it was time for her to stop trying to pull things back. But the next morning was Sunday, and in the pocket of her coat there was still a scrap of paper with the address of a brownstone on Atwell Street, and she had nowhere left to go except forward. Now the story has to be told from the other side of that gate, about the man who stood in the rain and had already known everything about the woman who was coming for 3 weeks, because if you don't understand what he had lost, you won't understand why he still let her walk inside. Emilio Santangelo's wife was named Rosalie, and 2 years earlier, on a night near the end of November, Her car left the road on a curve along Route 44, at a place where a stream running beneath the ground made the pavement freeze before every other stretch around it. There was no other car. There were no witnesses. The case was closed with 2 words: accidental death, and on paper it was an ordinary death on a winter night in New England. Emilio didn't believe it. He didn't believe it for a single second. Not because he had any evidence, but because he knew exactly who he was, and he knew that the families of men like him didn't die ordinary deaths. He spent 2 years looking. He had men reconstruct that stretch of road foot by foot. He had the car inspected twice by 2 different places. He had every person within 50 miles of Providence who had a reason to hate him investigated, and there were a great many of them, and he went through every one. 2 years, and he found nothing. And his daughter hadn't spoken a single word since the morning someone came to knock on the door of the brownstone. Sabina had been 6 years old then. She didn't cry at the funeral, didn't cry in the months afterward, and she didn't speak either. She ate, she slept, she went to school, she did her homework, she nodded and shook her head, and she didn't make a sound. Emilio took her everywhere people told him he should take her, and he paid whatever price they asked, and no one managed to change anything. They gave him a name for what was happening to her, and he carried that name home and found that it didn't help at all, because a name doesn't make a man's daughter speak. There was one thing he never told any of those doctors, and he didn't tell them because he didn't know how. Every night, after Carmela turned off the light and closed the door, the little girl would crawl down onto the floor and take out a glass jar filled with pebbles she had collected from the garden. She arranged those stones on the hardwood floor in the shape of a woman. A head, 2 shoulders, 2 arms, a dress spreading wide at the bottom. She did it very slowly and very carefully. Then, when she was finished, she would sit and look at the figure for a while, and afterward she would sweep all the pebbles back into the jar and go to sleep. Every night was the same. Emilio had stood outside his daughter's door many times and watched through the narrow opening, and he had never stepped inside, because he couldn't think of a single thing to say that wouldn't ruin whatever was happening in there. That man could call anyone in this city at 3 o'clock in the morning and they would answer. He could make a house change hands in a single afternoon, and he stood outside his daughter's bedroom, afraid to step inside, because he didn't know what to say. In the end, he did the most humiliating thing he had ever done in his life. He went to see Father Bruno Cavallo at the rectory after evening mass on a Tuesday, sat down in the chair across from the priest's desk, and asked whether there was anyone in the parish who knew how to be around children. Not a doctor, not a specialist, just someone who knew how to be near them. Father Bruno looked at him for a long time, because he had known Emilio since he was an altar boy, and because he also knew exactly what the man sitting in front of him did for a living now. He didn't preach. He simply said he would ask, and 2 weeks later he sent over 3 applications. Emilio read them late one night in his study. The first had been written by someone whose credentials ran 2 pages long, and it said all the things people thought a man like him wanted to hear. The second did the same, only in different words. The third was handwritten on ruled paper by a 3rd-grade teacher at a public school in Olneyville, and it was much shorter than the other 2. There wasn't a single promise of results in it. There wasn't one sentence claiming she could cure the little girl. There was only one line near the end, and Emilio Santangelo read that line 3 times in a single night, and then sat very still for a long time in the dark room. She had written that she didn't promise to make the child speak. She only promised to sit beside her while she remained silent, for as long as it took. During the first week, Delia Kavanagh didn't try even once to make Sabina speak. Instead, she did something no one in that house had thought of. She brought home from school a small blackboard, the kind made to sit on a student's desk, about the size of an open book, and she placed it at one end of the kitchen table beside a box of chalk, then left it there without saying anything about it. In the morning, she would write a sentence on the board, something like, "Today is cold," and then she would leave for school. In the afternoon, when she came home, she would erase it and write something else. She did that for 4 days, and for 4 days the only handwriting on the board was hers. On the 5th afternoon, she came home, set down her bag, and saw another line beneath her own, written in a child's slanted white chalk, 5 words, with no question mark. "How long are you staying?" Delia stood looking at that sentence for quite a while, and later she would say that she had to draw one deep breath before picking up the chalk, because she understood exactly what she was being asked, and she understood that the wrong answer could close a door that might never open again. She didn't write that she would stay forever, because she had no right to promise that. She wrote that she didn't know what the last day would be, but she would tell Sabina before it came, and she would never leave without saying so. The next morning, beneath that sentence, there was one more word. Okay. From then on, the blackboard became something almost alive in that kitchen. Some days, it held only 2 words. Some days Sabina filled the entire board and erased it before anyone had time to read what she had written. Carmela later said that one morning she came downstairs early and found a cat drawn on the board, and beneath it, Delia had written a question asking what its name was, and Carmela stood there holding the coffee pot without daring to turn on the stove because she was afraid the noise might break whatever was happening. Then came the afternoons downstairs at the bakery. Emilio had a bakery on Atwell Street that his family had operated since his grandfather's time, and 4 o'clock in the afternoon was when the last batch of the day came out of the oven and the back kitchen grew quiet. Delia asked permission to take Sabina down there. The 2 of them stood side by side at the flour-covered work table, and Delia taught the girl how to press the heel of her hand into the dough and fold it over. And they worked beside each other in silence, and that silence wasn't the same as the silence upstairs. One afternoon, Sabina shaped the dough into a human head, then pressed in 2 eyes with her fingertip, and she looked up at Delia, and Delia laughed, and the little girl laughed too, without sound, but both her shoulders shook. One of the bakers standing in the back told Renzo that it was the first time he had ever seen the boss's little girl laugh inside that bakery. Carmela Ruggiero, meanwhile, needed exactly 11 days to change her mind about Delia. She had worked in that house for 20 years and had watched many kinds of people come through its doors, for many kinds of reasons. And in her heart, a young woman who appeared in the middle of a rainy night carrying an empty box was a woman who had come to take something, even if Carmela didn't yet know what that something was. Then, one night around 2 o'clock in the morning, she came downstairs for a glass of water and saw that the table lamp was still on. Delia was sitting there with the coat torn at the shoulder spread across her lap, needle and thread in her hands, sewing the rip closed with tiny, even stitches. Carmela stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and asked why she didn't ask the young master for money to buy a new coat, because he would give it to her without asking a single question. Delia didn't look up. She said she knew he would, and that was exactly why she wouldn't ask. The next day, Carmela left a plate of food for her in the oven beneath a cloth, and from that day until the end of her life, she never said another word against that woman. There was one more thing Delia noticed as early as the 2nd week, and she didn't ask anyone about it. Every few days, usually around dusk, Sabina would go up to the attic. The girl wasn't hiding anything. She simply went upstairs, pulled the wooden door partly closed behind her, and stayed there for a long time, sometimes nearly an hour. No sound ever came from above. When she came back down, she was exactly as she always was. Delia stood at the foot of the stairs several times and listened, and she never went up. Never asked Sabina what she did there. Never asked Carmela what was kept in the attic of that house. She had promised in her application that she would sit beside the child and wait, and she understood that waiting also meant not opening doors she hadn't been invited through. On a Thursday afternoon near the end of November, the box of chalk in the kitchen ran empty, and Emilio told Delia to go down to the bakery and get a new one from the stationery cabinet in the back office, and he said it as naturally as anything, still holding his coffee cup, his mind already on something else. He had forgotten that Thursday afternoons were when Renzo sat down there doing the books. Years later, he would remember that moment many times, the moment when he let an innocent sentence slip from his mouth and turned away, and he would always come to the same conclusion, that there are doors in a person's life no one deliberately opens. Sometimes people simply forget to lock them. Delia walked the 3 blocks down to the bakery after the sky had already begun to darken. The front was closed, the lights in the sales area were off, but the back door was still unlocked, and the office light was still on. She knocked twice. No one answered. She stood in the hallway for a while before pushing the door open, because she thought she would simply take a box of chalk and leave. Renzo had been there not long before. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 5. His phone was lying face down on the desk. His coffee was still warm, and his coat was still hanging over the back of the chair. Someone had called him away, and he had left so quickly that he hadn't had time to put anything away. On the desk, beneath the light of the lamp that was still burning, lay a bound file folder, open flat. And on the typed cover were 2 words Delia could read from 2 steps away. Her name. She stood there for a very long time. Then she did the thing she would never later try to excuse. She stepped forward and opened it. Inside was her life, arranged neatly in chronological order by someone who had never met her. There was a copy of Owen's death certificate. There was the file on the Mary Doyle and the crew manifest with Beck Kavanaugh's name on the fourth line. There was the civil judgment authorizing the garnishment of her wages. There were weekly payment records, nearly $400 a week, stretching across 2 full years. The name of the company receiving the money repeated again and again in the right-hand column. Even the rejected assistance application was there. Delia turned the pages one by one, and the strange thing was that she didn't feel angry. She had lived long enough in a world ruled by paperwork to understand that a man like Emilio Santangelo would never open his gate to anyone without first knowing who that person was. And if he hadn't lived that way, he wouldn't have made it to 34. She turned to the final page, and there she stopped. The last page wasn't an official document. It was a yellow note stuck to the inside back cover, handwritten in black ink, in a man's firm, slightly slanted hand. There was a date written in the upper corner, and that date was 10 days before the night she had stood outside his gate in the rain. Beneath it were only 3 words and a question mark. Pharaoh. Same person. Verify? Delia read those words, then read them again, then read them a 3rd time. She didn't know who Pharaoh was. She had never heard the name in her life. But she understood immediately, with that part of a person that understands before thought has time to catch up, that this note wasn't about a household employee who was about to be hired. This was the note of someone following a thread, and her name was somewhere along that thread, and the man who had written it had known that 10 days before she ever rang the bell at his gate. She closed the file, placed it exactly where it had been, took the box of chalk from the cabinet, and walked the 3 blocks home through the cold, without being able to remember afterward which streets she had crossed. That night, after Sabina had gone to sleep, she went downstairs to the kitchen and stood at the end of the table, and she asked him directly, her voice calmer than she had expected it to be. She told him she had seen the file. Emilio set down his cup. He didn't ask where she had found it, didn't ask whether she had taken anything, didn't say a single word of reproach about the fact that she had opened it. He only nodded once and said yes. He had had it 3 weeks before she came. She asked him why. He said he didn't allow anyone to enter the house where his daughter lived without knowing who that person was, and that if she had thought otherwise, then she had given him more credit than he deserved. She asked about the yellow note on the last page. She repeated the words exactly as they had been written, and asked him who Pharaoh was. And this was where that night turned in a direction Delia Kavanagh hadn't prepared for at all. Emilio Santangelo didn't avoid the question, didn't change the subject, didn't tell her it was business that had nothing to do with her. He looked at her for a long time, then said very quietly that she was asking the wrong question, that she shouldn't ask why he knew, because that question was too easy to answer, and the answer wasn't worth anything. That the question she should be asking was why, after knowing everything contained in that file, he had still opened the gate and still let her walk inside. Delia stood there waiting. She waited a long time, but he didn't answer that question. Not that night, and not once during the 4 months that followed. Something strange happened after that night, and it was strange enough that neither of them noticed it while it was happening. An unanswered question should have pushed 2 people farther apart. Instead, it made them sit down. Around 9:30 at night, after Sabina had gone to sleep and Carmela had gone upstairs to her room, Delia began falling into the habit of coming down to the kitchen to make a pot of tea, and Emilio began falling into the habit of being there at exactly that hour. And neither of them ever said aloud that they were meeting each other, because they both knew that if they said it, whatever it was would disappear. They sat at opposite corners of the table. Only one light above the stove was left on, and they told each other things neither of them had ever told anyone else. One night, in early December, Emilio told her something even Renzo didn't know in full. He said that over the past 2 years he had hired 3 different investigators. The first was a former inspector from Boston. The second worked for a private firm in New York, and the third was someone he had to wait 4 months to hire, and the fee was twice what the other 2 had charged combined. All 3 were serious men. All 3 received every document he gave them, and all 3, after 3 different lengths of time, eventually did the same thing. They sat down in front of him and gave his money back. Delia asked whether they were afraid. Emilio shook his head and said frightened men didn't return money. Frightened men took the money, wrote a thick report, and said there was nothing to find, because that was safer for them. These 3 returned the money because there was nothing for them to find. The last one, that old man from New York, had said something Emilio had remembered ever since. that in his line of work, the most frightening thing wasn't a case that had been covered up well, but a case that was completely clean, and a client who refused to believe it was clean. Emilio stopped there and was quiet for a long time. Then he added that the problem was, he couldn't believe it. Because if it truly had been nothing more than an icy curve, then he would have to live the rest of his life knowing his wife had died for no reason, and that for 2 years he had been searching for an enemy not because he wanted revenge, but because having an enemy was easier to endure than having nothing at all. Delia didn't say anything. She only poured more tea into his cup, and that was all she did, and it was enough. A few nights later, it was her turn. She took from her wallet a sheet of paper folded into quarters, worn soft along the creases, opened it on the table, and pushed it toward him. She said she had never shown this to anyone, not the principal, not the priest, not the lawyer who had listened to her for 20 minutes. She said she had kept it in her wallet the entire time and carried it with her everywhere, and that she had opened it and read it again no fewer than 400 times over 2 years, and she said that number as calmly as someone reading out the answer to a calculation. He asked what she was looking for when she read it. Delia was silent for a while, then said she was trying to find the line where she had gone wrong. She said she was a teacher, that her profession was built around reading instructions and following them, that she had taught hundreds of children to read the directions carefully before answering a question, and that if someone like her had filled out an application incorrectly, then the mistake had to be somewhere on this piece of paper, and she needed to find it. She said she had gone through every line, every checked box, every line of fine print on the back. She said there were nights when she read it 3 times in a row, put it away, then took it out and read it again. And she said the last part very softly, that if she could find where she had made the mistake, then at least everything would have a reason, and a reason was easier to live with than no reason at all. Emilio Santangelo pulled the paper closer and read it. He read for a very long time, longer than it should have taken to read a single page, and she sat across the table watching him, her heart beating fast, because she thought this man knew paperwork. This man would find the mistake she had searched for 400 times and never found. When he finished, he folded the paper along the same old creases, pushed it back toward her, and said only one thing. He said she hadn't made a mistake on any line, that the form had been designed for her to fail. Delia sat very still. She had prepared herself to hear that she had done something wrong. She had never prepared herself to hear that she hadn't, and that the 2 years she had spent examining every line for her own mistake were 2 years spent searching for something that had never existed. She picked up the paper, looked at it, then put it back into her wallet the way she always did. But that night was the last night she ever took it out to read. 3 days after that night at the kitchen table, Carmela Ruggiero knocked on Delia's bedroom door at 9 o'clock in the evening, and she wasn't carrying the tea tray the way she usually did. She asked whether Delia could come to her room for a little while, and she asked it in the voice of someone who had been weighing this decision for a very long time. Carmela's room was at the end of the second-floor hallway, small and neat, and inside it stood a wooden cabinet that she unhand with a key she kept on her person. From the bottom of the cabinet, she took out something wrapped in cloth, placed it on the table, and unfolded the fabric. It was a large leather-bound ledger, its spine worn with age, the kind of book people used before everything was moved onto computers. Delia looked at it, then at her, and before she could ask anything, Carmela said exactly one sentence. She said Delia was the first person who had ever walked into this house without asking what he had. Then she told the story, briefly, in an even voice, like someone who had rehearsed it in her mind for 3 years. 3 years earlier, she had gone down to the bakery one morning earlier than usual and found the safe in the office open. She hadn't meant to look, but she had looked, and what she saw made her stand there for a very long time. Then she took the ledger from the safe, wrapped it in her apron, carried it home, and hid it in the cabinet in her room. No one asked about it. No one searched for it. There were more things in that safe than one old ledger, and when an old book disappeared, no one noticed right away, and the person who should have noticed was occupied with much larger matters at the time. Delia asked why she had kept it. Carmela said she hadn't known who to give it to. She said that if she gave it to the police, she would be hurting the very man who had paid her wages for 20 years and who had held her upright at her husband's funeral. She didn't dare give it to the young master, because she wasn't sure what he would do with it, and what frightened her most was the possibility that he would do nothing at all. So she kept it. She said she was old now, and didn't want to die with this thing still sitting in her cabinet, and that she had spent 3 years waiting for someone decent enough to walk into this house, and she believed her waiting was over. Delia carried the ledger back to her room, sat down on the edge of the bed, and opened it. Inside were handwritten entries, hundreds of lines, recorded in different inks over different years. Every line held a name, a number, a date, and a column of abbreviated notes she didn't understand. She turned the pages slowly, and she began recognizing the names. They were the names of her neighbors: the elderly woman who sold flowers on the corner of Knight Street, the man who repaired cars for half of Olneyville, the names of 2 families whose children had been in her class, and she could see the faces of those 2 children perfectly when she reached those lines. An entire neighborhood was inside that ledger, written down by hand, one line after another, like a roll call of the drowning. She kept turning the pages, and about 2/3 of the way through the book, in the middle of the right-hand page, she saw the name she had known she would find from the moment she opened the first page. Beck Kavanagh. She placed her finger on the line and left it there for a while. There was the date he had signed. There was the original amount. There were several abbreviated notes in the remarks column, and at the end of the line, stamped in slightly crooked blue ink, were the words Delia had to read 3 times before she understood them: paid in full. Beside the stamp was a handwritten date. She stared at that date. Then she took out her phone, opened the calendar, and counted backward. The date of that stamp was 2 months before the day the Mary Doyle left the harbor and never returned. Delia Kavanagh sat motionless on the edge of the bed for a long time, then slid down until she was sitting on the hardwood floor with her back against the bed frame, the ledger open across her lap. She didn't cry. Later, she would say that the most frightening thing about that night was the fact that she didn't cry. She sat on the floor and did the arithmetic in her head, because she was a teacher, and mental arithmetic was something she could still do even when the rest of her mind had stopped working properly. 2 years, 104 weeks, nearly $400 every week, more than $40,000, bread and tomato soup. The hours spent watching children after school, the coat torn at the shoulder that she had sat mending at 2 o'clock in the morning instead of asking for money to buy a new one. The night she waited 40 minutes for the police on the stairs and told herself that perhaps the world had decided she wasn't allowed to keep anything. All of it, 104 weeks in a row, paid toward a debt that had already been stamped paid in full before her husband ever stepped aboard that boat. And Beck hadn't known. That was the last thought that came to her before dawn, and it was the thought that left her sitting motionless on the floor for another hour. He had signed a loan, hidden it from his wife, taken a place on a fishing boat in the middle of February to pay a debt that, by then, he no longer owed. No one had told him. Someone had stamped those words onto that line in blue ink, closed the ledger, and kept collecting the money. Daylight had already filled the window, and Delia was still sitting on the floor with the ledger open across her lap. And perhaps she should have closed it there, but people don't close something like that once they have reached a page like that. She kept turning, 10 pages after her husband's name, in the lower half of the left-hand page, written in a different ink and in a different hand. She found a line that made her sit upright. Santangelo? R. The date entered was in September. Delia knew perfectly well that Rosalie Santangelo had died near the end of November, because Carmela had told her during her second week in this house. 2 months. That name had been entered into the ledger exactly 2 months before the night on Route 44. She studied the line carefully, and she saw at once that it wasn't like the others. In the amount column, there was no word for loan. There was another name beside it, in parentheses, the name of a woman Delia recognized, because she was an elderly woman who always sat in the 4th pew on the left at St. Bartholomew Church, a woman Delia had greeted several times at the church door after Sunday morning mass. In the notes column were several abbreviations, and one word that wasn't abbreviated at all, written clearly in black ink and underlined twice: refused. Delia sat staring at that word for a very long time and began piecing together in her mind what had happened that September. Emilio Santangelo's wife had gone looking for the people holding the debt of an elderly woman from her parish, and she had offered to buy it back with her own money so that the woman could be left in peace. They had refused, but they hadn't simply refused and let the matter end there. They had written Rosalie's name into the ledger, not because she owed anyone a single dollar, but because in a book like this, a name written beside a number meant that person had stepped within reach. The wife of the man who ruled Federal Hill had her name inside another man's debt ledger. That alone was enough. And then Delia understood a second thing. something that sent cold through her entire body, that for Rosalie's name to have been entered into this ledger, Rosalie must have sat in the room where this ledger was kept. She had seen it. That September, that woman had walked into a small office in Silver Lake to ask for help for an elderly woman who worshipped at the same church, and she had walked back out, knowing that somewhere inside that office there was a leather-bound ledger containing the names of hundreds of her neighbors. 2 months later, she was dead on an icy curve. Delia closed the ledger and sat motionless in her room until she heard Carmela waking downstairs in the kitchen. She waited until evening, waited until Sabina was asleep, then carried the ledger down to the study, where Emilio and Renzo were sitting with several papers concerning the warehouses by the harbor. She placed it on the desk in front of him and said she needed him to look at this page, and she had already opened it to the page bearing his wife's name. Emilio pulled the ledger closer. He read the line. Then he said nothing for so long that Renzo began shifting his position in the chair. Emilio turned back several dozen pages, slowly, 1 page at a time, his eyes moving down the names. He stopped at the page bearing Beck Kavanaugh's name. He looked at the blue ink stamp and the handwritten date beside it, and she saw his jaw tighten once, then release. Then he turned forward again and read for another 15 minutes. And during those 15 minutes, no one in the room spoke a word. At last he closed the ledger, placed both hands on top of it, and lifted his eyes to Delia. He didn't ask where she had gotten it. He didn't ask why it had been inside his house. He asked her one question, and he asked it very softly, more softly than he spoke even to his own daughter. He said, "The night before you came here." He said, "You told me you fell on the stairs." Then he stopped there and said nothing more. Renzo stood up and left the room, closing the door behind him, and no one had told him to do it. Delia stood on the other side of the desk, and in less than 3 seconds she understood. He had known. He had known from the very first second, out there in the rain at the gate, when she looked straight into his eyes and lied. The man who had 30 pages about her life, the man who had written the name Pharaoh on a yellow note 10 days earlier, the man who knew exactly how much money was being taken from her wages every week, and who was taking it, that man had stood in the rain and listened to her say she had fallen down the stairs, and he had nodded, and he hadn't asked again. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not once during 4 months, through dozens of evenings spent sitting at opposite corners of the kitchen table with a pot of tea between them. He had promised her in that kitchen, in front of Carmela, that he wouldn't ask her anything she didn't choose to tell him herself, and he had kept that promise even when the answer was the one thing he needed most in the world. People often think that when a secret is discovered, the explosion comes immediately. But in real life it doesn't. It comes slowly, and the way it comes is what makes it frightening. Augie Pharaoh didn't know where the ledger was, but he knew it was no longer inside his safe, and he had known that for 3 years without doing anything about it, because for those 3 years nothing had moved. Then, during the first week of December, one of his men reported that the woman living in the Sant'Angelo house was the wife of the name written about 2/3 of the way through the ledger. And Augie Pharaoh, 57 years old, a man who had survived 3 generations of bosses in that neighborhood by always knowing when the ground beneath him was beginning to tilt, understood immediately that he was standing on a slope. The first move came through the mail. A letter from a lawyer was sent to Delia's old mailbox at the apartment in Olneyville, the mailbox of an apartment where she no longer lived, and the new landlord called the school to ask whether she wanted to collect it. The letter said, in the most polite language the legal profession could produce, that their client had noted Mrs. Kavanaugh's change of residence, that they hoped she would provide her new address for future correspondence, and that any documents belonging to their client that were currently in her possession needed to be returned. There wasn't a single word in that letter that could legally be called a threat. That was exactly what made it frightening. They were telling her that they knew where she was, and they were saying it in the voice of a law office. The second move came 4 days later. Renzo reported that a car had parked outside the bakery at 7 o'clock in the evening, exactly at closing time, and remained there for 40 minutes before leaving. No one got out. No one came inside. 2 nights later it returned at the same hour, and this time it parked at an angle across the street, where there was a clear view of the back door. Emilio increased the number of men at the bakery, and said nothing more. The third move came on a Monday morning. The baker who opened the shop at 4:30 found a white envelope placed neatly on the back step, with no stamp and no name on it. Inside was a copy of the debt restructuring agreement Beck Kavanaugh had signed alone in a small office in Silver Lake, the original document that a lawyer had once asked Delia whether she possessed. and she had been forced to answer no. Clipped to it was a handwritten note. One line, unsigned. It said that there were still many papers belonging to her family where that one came from. Renzo put the envelope down on the desk in the office, and finally said what he had been wanting to say for 2 weeks. He said the old man was testing whether Emilio still had teeth, that if they let this sit for another week, everyone in the neighborhood would understand that Emilio was afraid to move against someone from the old generation, and Renzo said he only needed 3 men in one night. Emilio listened to everything without interrupting him once. Then he said no. Renzo asked why, and he asked in the voice of a man who had earned the right to ask, because the two of them had grown up together and had been through too much side by side. Emilio stood, walked to the office door, and pointed toward the ceiling, toward the second floor, where there was a room in which a little girl arranged pebbles on the floor every night in the shape of a woman and then swept them back into a jar. He said he wasn't going to start a war while his daughter was sleeping upstairs. He said who had been lost the last time this house had a war, and he said it very quietly, and Renzo didn't ask anything else. That night Emilio spoke to Delia in the kitchen, and he told her plainly that he wanted her to take a few weeks away from teaching, that he would cover the wages she lost, that he only needed that much time to put everything in order. Delia set down her teacup. She asked whether he thought she would be safer inside this house, and he said yes. She said he might be right. Then she said that on Monday morning, when the bell rang at 8:15, 22 children would sit down at 22 desks in a classroom in Olneyville, and 11 of them had no one to bring them to school or take them home, and 3 of them got the only proper meal they ate all day from the school cafeteria, and every one of them would look toward the desk at the front of the room and see it empty. She said she had left them once already. During the week she sat in the hospital, and she wasn't going to do it a second time because of a car parked outside a bakery. Emilio said he had people, that he could take care of it. Delia looked at him and said that she had people too. She said however many people he had, she had just as many, except hers weren't even 4 feet 3 inches tall, and they showed up every Monday morning. Near the end of February, the weather service warned of an ice storm moving inland from Narragansett Bay. And in New England, people don't fear snow. They fear freezing rain, because snow simply settles, while freezing rain clings to power lines until they snap. That afternoon, Sabina coughed a few times while doing her homework at the kitchen table. 3 dry coughs, and Delia placed a hand against the girl's forehead and then let it go, because her skin was cool and she was still asking for another piece of cake. Emilio stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat in his hand. There was business at the harbor, and the meeting had been arranged since the beginning of the week. He asked Delia whether he should stay, and she looked at the little girl bent over her writing and told him to go, that she had Dr. Petrucci's number, that there was enough medicine in the house, and that as long as he was back before morning, everything would be fine. He nodded and left. Years later, whenever Delia remembered that night, she would always say that she had made the right decision based on everything she could see at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and that sometimes being right about what you can see still isn't enough. At 11 o'clock that night, the lights in the house flickered twice and went completely dark. The entire stretch of Atwell Street disappeared into darkness. Delia had already been awake for about 20 minutes because she had heard the sound of the girl's breathing change through the partly open door, and by the time the power failed, she had already been sitting on the edge of the bed for a while. She turned on the flashlight on her phone, called 311, and the dispatcher said the waiting time was more than 4 hours. Carmela called Dr. Petrucci, and he said he was on the other side of the river, that the bridge had been closed because of the ice, and he stayed on the line for another 3 minutes, giving them instructions one step at a time, before the signal disappeared. The brownstone stood inside a historic preservation district, and permanent generators weren't allowed on the fronts of houses like that, so the only thing in the house capable of running was a portable generator kept in the shed behind the garden, and Delia knew it was there because she had seen Renzo pull it out back in November. The nebulizer wouldn't work without electricity. She gave Sabina her rescue inhaler, and she counted. And when enough time had passed, she gave her a second dose. Then a third, and after the third dose she looked at her wristwatch and knew that 3 doses hadn't been enough, and that according to everything they had been told, this was the point when they were supposed to go to the hospital, and tonight the hospital couldn't be reached. So she did the things she had learned during 19 days in another room 3 years earlier. She carried the little girl into the bathroom and turned every hot water faucet on until warm steam filled the small room. She placed 3 pillows behind Sabina's back so she could sit upright instead of lying down. She rested her hand against the girl's back and counted her breaths with her wristwatch, counting for 30 seconds at a time. and she traced each number with her fingertip against the bathroom tile so she wouldn't forget it. And she kept her voice perfectly steady. That was the hardest thing she did all night, harder than everything else, because inside her there was something screaming, and she couldn't allow even one word of it to escape. She spoke normally. She talked about the blackboard in the kitchen and the cat Sabina had drawn. Then she sang, very softly, an old song her mother used to sing, and she sang it over and over again, and not once did her voice tremble. Carmela knelt on the other side, holding the girl's hand in hers, occasionally lifting a cup of warm water to her lips and pressing a warm cloth against the back of her neck. Carmela was 63 years old, and she had lived through many long nights in her life, and later she would say that what she remembered most wasn't her own fear, but the hands of that woman, both of them resting against the child's back, never trembling, never lifting away even once for more than an hour. Around midnight, Delia stood up. She handed her watch to Carmela, told her to count for 30 seconds at a time, and remember each number, then put on her coat and went outside. Freezing rain was falling, and everything that could be touched was already covered in a clear layer of ice, and she made her way toward the shed behind the garden, keeping one hand against the wall, falling once on the brick path. The generator was in the farthest corner. The spare gasoline can stood beside it. Her hands had gone so numb that she couldn't feel the cap, and when she poured the fuel, she spilled nearly half of it across the concrete floor, and she stood there for 1 second in the dark shed looking at the gasoline spreading beneath her feet, then poured in what remained. She pulled the starter cord 6 times. On the 7th, the engine caught. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, the lights in the second-floor hallway came back on, 3 bulbs, yellow and weak. And Carmela looked up at those lights as though something had just been returned to the house. Delia plugged the nebulizer into the outlet and switched it on. The machine ran steadily, a small, warm hum, constant and unbroken. And inside the room where electricity had returned, the 3 of them sat in silence listening to that sound until morning was almost there. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, the breathing in that room had changed. Steadier now, lighter, and Carmela placed a hand on the little girl's forehead, looked over at Delia, and gave a single nod, then went downstairs to boil water because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Sabina slept. Delia remained seated beside the bed, her back resting against the wooden frame, and she stayed there while gray morning light slowly seeped through the gap in the curtains, so exhausted that she could no longer think about anything at all. She was still wearing her wet shoes. Around her wrist was the mark left by the watch she had kept strapped too tightly through the night without realizing it. She was about to stand and change her clothes when she heard a very small sound in the room, so small that she thought she had imagined it. She turned around. The little girl's eyes were open. She looked at Delia, and she spoke. Her voice was hoarse and faint and strange to hear, because it was a voice that hadn't been used inside this house for a very long time, and she said only 4 words. "Don't tell my father." Delia sat perfectly still. She had thought about this moment many times over the past 4 months, had imagined it happening in many different ways, and none of the ways she had ever imagined looked anything like this. She had waited for someone to be called by name. She had waited for a question. She had never waited for a warning. She leaned closer and asked very softly what she wasn't supposed to tell her father. And the little girl looked at her for a long time, then closed her eyes and said nothing else. And a short while later, she truly fell back asleep. Delia sat on the floor beside the bed in that gray light and felt a chill run down her spine. Not because of the long night, but because something inside her mind had just broken apart and rearranged itself into a completely different shape. For 4 months, she had believed, as everyone in this house believed, that this child was silent because she was hurting. They had taken her everywhere because they believed that. They had given what was happening to her names from books. But a child who is hurting doesn't tell an adult not to tell anyone. A child who is hurting cries, or sleeps, or clings to someone. What she had just heard wasn't the voice of pain. It was the voice of someone guarding something, someone who had been guarding it for a very long time, and in one exhausted moment near dawn, she had accidentally revealed that there was something being guarded. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the iron gate outside the courtyard made a sound. Emilio Santangelo had walked the final 2 miles home because the roads were covered in ice and the car couldn't make it up the hill. And he entered the foyer with wet hair, one sleeve of his coat torn in a long line, and behind him came Renzo with his left shoulder wrapped in the kind of bandage someone had put on in a hurry. What happened at the harbor has to be told clearly, because otherwise people will misunderstand that man. He hadn't gone there to start a war. Augie Farrow had chosen the night of the storm to send men to the warehouse because the police were occupied. Half the city had lost power, and he had calculated that Santangelo's men would fire first, and once a gunshot rang out at the harbor, everything afterward would follow the old direction. The direction men like him knew by heart. Emilio arrived sometime after midnight and did exactly one thing. He stood in the middle. For nearly an hour, he stood between his own men and Farrow's men in the freezing rain, and he spoke very quietly, the way he always did, and the tear in his sleeve came from the moment when he had to pull Renzo back. Renzo's shoulder was injured for the same reason, because Emilio had pulled him back. Not a single shot was fired at the Providence harbor that night, and that was all Emilio Santangelo wanted. And later he would say that it was the night he finally did the thing he should have done many years earlier. He reached the foot of the staircase, and Carmela was standing at the top with a towel draped over one hand. She looked down at him. She had meant to tell him about the night before, about the power going out, about the 3 doses of medicine, about the generator, but she didn't tell him any of those things. She said 3 words instead, and her voice broke on the last one. She said, "She has spoken." Emilio stood at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't go up right away. He placed one hand on the newel post and simply stood there. And when Delia stepped out from the hallway and looked down, she saw that man standing as though someone had struck him in the chest. He lifted his eyes to her. He didn't ask whether the little girl was all right, didn't ask what had happened during the night, didn't ask why the foyer smelled of gasoline. He asked only one question, and there was almost no sound left in his voice. He asked what she had said. And Delia Kavanagh stood at the top of the stairs after a night without sleep, those 4 words still whole inside her mind, and had 3 seconds to decide what she was going to tell this man. Delia told him the truth. She stood at the top of the staircase and repeated those 4 words exactly as Sabina had said them, adding nothing, leaving nothing out, offering no explanation, because she believed this man had already had too many things hidden from him in his life, and she wouldn't become the next person to do it. Emilio listened and said nothing. He went upstairs, stood in the doorway of his daughter's room watching her sleep for a long time, then came back down, and for the next 3 days he didn't mention what had happened to anyone even once. Those 3 days were strange ones inside the brownstone. Sabina recovered quickly, the way children often do, and she began to speak, but very little and very selectively, only a few sentences each day, mostly short things about whatever was directly in front of her. Yes, no, I'm full now. And every time she opened her mouth, all 3 adults in the house had to pretend nothing unusual had happened, so they wouldn't make her self-conscious. She never repeated those 4 words. Delia didn't ask about them either. She waited, because waiting was the only thing she had ever promised in that handwritten application on ruled paper. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, while Delia was wiping down the blackboard in the kitchen, the little girl came in, stood beside her, and took her hand. She didn't write anything on the board. She simply tugged, gently, and Delia set down the cloth and followed. The 2 of them went up to the 2nd floor, then to the end of the hallway, to the narrow wooden staircase leading to the attic. The staircase Delia had stood beneath several times over 4 months listening, but had never once climbed. The little girl went first, still holding her hand. The attic smelled of old wood and dust, and the last light of afternoon came through a small window in the gable. Sabina let go of her hand, walked directly to the windowsill, knelt down, and slipped her fingers into a gap between 2 floorboards. She lifted one of the boards. It had been loose for a long time, and she knew exactly which corner to raise, and Delia watched that practiced movement and understood that the child had done this many times before. Beneath it, between 2 beams, was an envelope. Its edges had yellowed and softened with age, and one corner had been folded over in the way paper becomes folded when someone has held it too many times. Sabina took it out, stood up, and turned around. Then she did something Delia would remember for the rest of her life. She held the envelope out with both hands. Not one, both hands, raising it to the level of Delia's chest, the way someone gives back something they have carried for too long and can no longer bear to carry. Delia reached out and took it. It was light, so light that it was almost impossible to believe something that weighed so little could have been so heavy. The little girl stood there looking at the envelope now resting in someone else's hands, and she said one sentence, her voice small but clear, without stumbling. She said, "I was keeping it for Mom." Delia didn't ask which mother. She didn't ask how long she had been keeping it. She didn't ask what was inside, didn't ask why it had been hidden beneath that particular floorboard. didn't ask whether Sabina knew who it belonged to. Delia had taught children for 8 years, and she knew exactly what it looked like when a child had just put down something she had been carrying for far too long, and she knew that if an adult started asking questions at that moment, the child would pick the burden back up again. So she asked nothing. She only crouched down until they were eye to eye, holding the envelope in one hand and reaching out with the other. Sabina stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Delia's neck. She held on tightly, far more tightly than anyone would expect from an 8-year-old child, and buried her face against Delia's shoulder, and her shoulders began to shake. Delia wrapped her arms around her and didn't say a word. She let the child cry until there was nothing left to cry. She had spent 4 months sitting beside her waiting for this moment, and now that the moment had finally come, the only thing left to do was sit still and hold her. Then, while she was still crying, her face buried against Delia's shoulder, the little girl spoke her second words since those 4 in the bedroom. She called her Mom. Delia Kavanagh sat on the dusty attic floor in the February afternoon light, with a yellowed envelope in one hand and a crying child in the other, and she heard that word, and she didn't correct her. She didn't say that she was mistaken. She didn't say that her mother was in heaven. She only held her a little tighter and told her she was here, that she wasn't going anywhere, that they were going downstairs now and she would make her some toast. And she said those ordinary little things in the steadiest voice she could manage, the same voice she had held through the entire night of the storm, because she understood that some moments are too large, and the only way a child can pass safely through them is with an adult beside them talking about toast. The 2 of them went downstairs. Delia kept the envelope in her coat pocket and didn't open it until the little girl was asleep. At 10 o'clock that night, after the little girl had gone to sleep, Delia sat alone in her room and opened the envelope. There were 2 things inside. The first was a handwritten letter, covering both sides of a sheet of paper, written in a woman's hand, hurried but clear. The second was 3 more pages, also handwritten, crowded with rows of names and numbers copied into columns. Delia read the letter once, then set it down on the table and sat motionless for 15 minutes, then picked it up and read it a second time from the beginning. Rosalie Santangelo had written that letter to her husband. She wrote that she knew about the ledger, that she had seen it with her own eyes in a room in Silver Lake one September afternoon, when she went there to plead on behalf of an elderly woman from the parish, and that what she saw in those few short minutes had kept her awake for weeks afterward. She wrote that she had tried to find a way to get hold of it, and that in the end she had managed to obtain 3 pages. And she made it clear that she had copied those 3 pages by hand, rather than photographing them, because in this house there wasn't a single telephone that truly belonged to one person. There wasn't a single computer someone else couldn't open, and she wrote that he knew that better than she did. She wrote that she had arranged to meet someone at a prosecutor's office in Boston the following morning, and that she was leaving that very night because she was afraid that if she waited until morning, she would change her mind. Then she wrote the passage Delia had to read 3 times. She wrote that she knew what he would call what she was doing. She wrote that she wasn't doing it because she had stopped loving him, but because she had stood in the kitchen watching their daughter play on the floor and thought about the fact that 15 years from now, the little girl would understand what her father did for a living, and Rosalie couldn't bear the thought. She wrote that she had begged him many times in many different ways, and he had never listened, and that this was the only way she had left that she could think of. She apologized. She wrote the words "I'm sorry" 3 times across those 2 sides of paper, and on the final line, just above her signature, she wrote that she would be home before daylight, and that she was leaving the letter so he wouldn't worry if he woke before she returned. Delia folded the letter, sat there a little longer, then went up to the attic to find him, because Carmela said he had been there ever since he heard the attic door open that afternoon. Emilio was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall beneath the gable window, beside the place where the floorboard had been lifted and still hadn't been put back. Delia sat down across from him, and before handing him the envelope, she told him 3 things. She said what was inside belonged to Rosalie. She said the little girl had kept it beneath that floorboard and had given it to her willingly that day. And she said the 3rd thing more slowly than the first 2, that whatever was written inside, he had to remember that the person who hid it had been 6 years old, and that when he finished reading, he would have to walk down those stairs and sit in front of his daughter, and the way he looked at her then would be something she carried for the rest of her life. Then she handed him the envelope, and she stayed there with him while he read, because she didn't think a man should have to read a letter like that alone. He read very slowly. At one point he stopped halfway through, laid the letter face down across his lap, lifted his face toward the attic ceiling, and stayed that way for a long time, then turned it over and continued reading. When he finished the letter, he unfolded the 3 handwritten pages, and he recognized his wife's handwriting in those columns of numbers, and that was when his shoulders collapsed. 2 things came to Emilio Santangelo at the same time on the attic floor that night, and there was no way to separate one from the other. The first was that his wife had intended to take those pages to federal prosecutors, which meant she had been prepared to send him to prison, and she had done it not out of hatred, but because she had sat down, considered everything, and concluded that their daughter would be better off with her father in prison. The second came only a few seconds after the first, and it was much colder. If she had sat in the room where that ledger was kept in September, if her name had been entered into it with the word "refused" underlined twice, then someone knew she had seen it. And 2 months later, her car had left the road on a curve. He sat without moving for a very long time. Then he said, his voice rough, that he had spent 2 years and hired 3 investigators searching for a thread. And that thread had been lying beneath the floor of his own house, 14 steps from where he slept, for all of those 2 years. Delia asked what he was going to do. Emilio looked down at the 3 handwritten pages in his hands and spoke the truth he would have to live with for the rest of his life. He said he would never be able to prove the second thing. There were no witnesses, no cameras on that stretch of road. The car was gone, and the only person who knew what had happened that night would never open his mouth. He said he could be certain in his own heart until the day he died and still never have a single piece of paper he could put into anyone else's hands. And he said the last thing very softly, that perhaps that was the part of the punishment meant for him, and that he thought he deserved it. The next morning was Saturday, and Emilio Santangelo didn't go anywhere. He sat in the kitchen from early morning with a cup of cold coffee in front of him, and Delia knew he was preparing himself because she had seen that look on the faces of parents who were about to tell their child something difficult. Around 9 o'clock, Sabina came downstairs. He didn't call her into the study. He didn't tell her to sit in the chair across from him. He did something he had never done with anyone in this city in his entire life. He lowered himself onto one knee on the kitchen floor until he was at eye level with his daughter, and he stayed that way until the conversation was over. He told her he had read the letter. He told her he knew she had kept it for a very long time and had carried it alone. Then he said the most important thing, and he said it slowly, 1 sentence at a time, so the 8-year-old child standing in front of him would have time to hear every word. He said that letter couldn't change anything that had happened. He said that even if he had read it that night, everything still would have happened exactly the same way, because her mother had already left before he woke up, and because that stretch of road had already frozen before she walked out of the house. He said there wasn't a single word on that piece of paper that could run faster than a car. The little girl stood still, listening, both hands clutching the hem of her nightgown. Emilio went on, and his voice began to lose its steadiness. He said that things like that letter belonged to adults, that in a house, adults were the ones who were supposed to carry the heavy things, and children weren't. Never. Not any child. He told her that she had been carrying something for him that he should have carried himself, and that she had carried it for such a long time with no one beside her. Then he said he was sorry. The man whose house made all of Federal Hill lower its voice when people passed by. The man who hadn't apologized to anyone in 17 years, knelt on the floor of his own kitchen and apologized to his 8-year-old daughter for allowing her to carry something like that alone for so long. Sabina stood completely still for a long time after those words. Then she asked him a question, and it was the longest sentence she had ever spoken in her life. Longer than the 4 words near dawn in the bedroom. Longer than the sentence she had spoken in the attic. She asked whether her mother was angry with her. The entire kitchen went silent. Carmela stood at the sink with her back turned and didn't dare turn around. Delia stood in the doorway with one hand gripping the frame. And Emilio Santangelo, who for 2 years hadn't been able to answer a single question about his wife without inventing something, who had lied to his daughter about that night with the vague phrases adults use when they don't know what else to say, this time had an answer. He said no. He said her mother wasn't angry, and he said he knew that for certain. He wasn't guessing, because he had read the letter and he knew who her mother had written it for and why she had written it. He told her that her mother had written that letter because she was worried about her. That from the first line to the last, across both sides of that page, the person her mother had been thinking about was her. He said that a mother who walked out of her house in the middle of the night because of her child couldn't possibly be angry with that child. Not for a single second. Not for anything. And he said the last part more softly than everything else. That if her mother knew Sabina had blamed herself for this long, that was what would have made her sad, not the envelope. Sabina stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, and he held her, and he didn't say anything more because he couldn't. Father and daughter stayed that way on the kitchen floor for a long time. Carmela turned the faucet up louder and pretended to wash plates that were already clean. Delia stepped back into the hallway and stood there until she could breathe normally again. That evening, Sabina sat at the table with the 3 adults, and she talked through the entire meal. She told them about the cat she had drawn on the blackboard and gave the cat a name. She asked Carmela why bread dough had to rise twice. She told Delia that yesterday's math homework had been too easy. She talked the way an ordinary 8-year-old child talks, nothing remarkable about it. The wandering little stories of a Saturday evening in a family. And the 3 adults sitting around that table finished their dinner without daring to look one another in the eyes even once from beginning to end, because all 3 of them knew that a single glance would be enough to make someone cry, and no one wanted to spoil the precious, ordinary thing happening at that dinner table that night. Now comes the part where anyone who has sat listening this far is waiting for one thing, and it is the thing that usually happens in stories about men like Emilio Santangelo. People wait for some night. They wait for a car heading toward Silver Lake. They wait for the moment when that man finally uses the power this entire city fears and does the thing that, under the old rules of this neighborhood, he has every right to do. That didn't happen. What happened instead was that one morning in early March, Emilio Santangelo carried the leather-bound ledger and the 3 handwritten pages copied by his wife to a photocopy shop on Broadway, an ordinary shop anyone could walk into, and he stood there for nearly 2 hours making copies of every page with his own hands. He made 3 sets. The first he sent to the Rhode Island Attorney General's office. The second he sent to the federal agency responsible for protecting consumers in financial matters, along with a list of debts that had been stamped paid in full, but were still being collected, with Beck Kavanaugh's name appearing on page 9. The third he sent to the newsroom of the Providence Journal. And he sent that one last, because he knew that once a newspaper had this in its hands, there would no longer be any agency capable of putting it into a drawer and forgetting about it. And in all 3 copies, his own name was there too. That ledger wasn't only Augie Farrow's ledger. It was the ledger of a system, and within that system were lines leading to 3 warehouses by the harbor, debts his construction company had guaranteed, and names belonging to people his own men had spent years collecting money from. He had sat down and read it carefully for 2 nights before taking it to be copied, so he knew exactly what he was putting into other people's hands. He didn't tear out a single page. He didn't black out a single line. He copied it intact from the first page to the last, and sent all 3 sets out on the same morning. Renzo found out that afternoon and came to the house, and for the first time in his life he raised his voice inside his cousin's study. He asked if Emilio had lost his mind. He said everything that needed to be said, that they wouldn't stop with Farrow, that the 3 warehouses would be lost, that at least 24 people made their living from the things Emilio was handing over with his own hands, that there were other ways and he knew those ways perfectly well, that all it would take was one night for the old man to disappear and the ledger to become worthless paper. Emilio let him finish. Then he spoke. He said that 2 weeks earlier, after a night without power, his daughter had opened her mouth for the first time in all that time. He said that for 2 years he had imagined that moment more times than he could count, had wondered what she might say, and that in everything he had ever imagined, nothing had looked like what actually happened. The first 4 words his daughter said after all of it were, "Don't tell my father." He said that and stopped for a long time. Then he continued, very quietly, that a 6-year-old child in this house had picked up a letter and hidden it, and had carried that burden alone for 2 years, and she had done it because in this house people didn't tell one another the truth, and children learned quickly. He said he could keep the 3 warehouses, keep everything, and then 15 years from now, his daughter would understand what her father did for a living, and she would understand it in exactly the same way her mother had. He said he wouldn't let his child grow up in a house where people had to hide the truth from him, and that the only way to stop that from happening was for him to be the first person to stop hiding things. Renzo stood there for a very long time, then asked whether he understood how much this was going to cost him. Emilio said he did. What happened afterward unfolded slowly, the way things like this usually do, with no handcuffs in the street and no sudden noise. His lawyers worked for 4 months and negotiated a cooperation agreement, and its terms were simple enough to be brutal. He became the principal witness against Augie Farrow and the entire debt-buying network. And at the same time, he submitted evidence against himself and pleaded guilty to what belonged to his own part in the ledger. No one forced him to do the second part. He could have negotiated to keep himself out of it, and his lawyer told him that plainly in their first meeting, and Emilio refused on the spot. The sentence handed down on a July morning was 14 months. There were only 3 people sitting in the back row of the courtroom that day, and one of them was a third-grade teacher from Olneyville. He was due to report on Monday morning, and the Sunday night before was an ordinary evening in the brownstone, deliberately ordinary, because the 3 adults had agreed beforehand that no one would make it anything else. Sabina was allowed to stay up half an hour later than usual. Carmela cooked the dish the little girl liked best. Emilio sat with his daughter at the kitchen table and explained a math problem she had already solved on her own, but asked him about anyway. He had spoken to her 2 weeks earlier, truthfully and clearly, told her how many months and why. And she had cried once, and then stopped. And she had asked him whether he was doing this because of the letter, and he said yes. Partly because of that. At 9 o'clock, the little girl went to bed. Renzo arrived late, stood in the foyer for a while to finish discussing a few matters about the bakery, then put on his coat and prepared to leave. Delia walked him to the door. At the threshold, she called him back and asked him one question. Renzo stopped, turned around, and listened, and for a moment there was surprise on his face. Then it was gone. He said, "All right." Then he left. The person telling this story has no intention of telling anyone what that question was. Not because there is anything to hide, but because Delia Kavanagh lowered her voice when she asked it, and there was no one else in the foyer at the time. And there are questions people ask that way, because they want them to remain between 2 people. Then she went back into the kitchen. Emilio was sitting where he always sat, at one corner of the table, 1 chair away from her place, exactly the distance the 2 of them had kept since October. There was a pot of tea on the table. Neither of them said anything for the first few minutes. Then he spoke, without preparing the ground, in that quiet voice of his, the voice the entire city knew never needed to be loud. He said he had placed that notice because he was looking for a teacher. He said he had known exactly what he needed. Someone who knew how to sit beside his daughter. Someone patient. Someone he could pay a salary. Then he said that wasn't what he had received. He said what he had received was someone who taught him how to live inside his own house. He said he had lived in that house for 2 years without knowing what his daughter liked to eat, without daring to step into her room at night, without being able to answer a single question about his wife without inventing something. He said she had arrived on a rainy night apologizing because she had nothing in her hands, and that from that night until now, she had given this house everything it had been missing. He stopped for a while. Then he said the hardest part. He said there had been a time when he thought about this as something he would ask of her because the little girl needed her, and that he had nearly said it to her that way, and he was glad he hadn't. He said he wasn't asking her to be useful to him anymore, that he was past that. He said he was asking her to let him love her, and he said he was asking her to wait for him 14 months, if she believed that was fair to her, and he made it clear that if she didn't think it was fair, he would understand that she didn't owe him a single day, that she had already paid far too much in her life for things she never owed. Delia sat in silence. Anyone who has followed this story from the beginning will know that this woman began almost every important sentence in her life with an apology. She had apologized outside the gate in the rain. She had apologized for taking up 20 minutes of a lawyer's time. She had even apologized to the 2 police officers for calling them out on a Saturday night. In the 2 years after that February, she had apologized to everyone for the single crime of still being alive when 2 other people were not. This time she didn't apologize. She looked straight at him and said that she had spent 2 years apologizing for existing, and she thought it was time she stopped. Then she continued, her voice still steady, and said that she would wait, and that she wasn't waiting because it was fair or unfair, but because on Monday morning he was going to do the thing his wife had died on the way to do, and because there was a child in this house whom she had promised she would tell before the day she ever left, and she hadn't told her. Emilio Santangelo reached across the corner of the table, and she placed her hand in his, and it was the first time the 2 of them had touched since the night he took the empty cardboard box from her hands in the foyer. They sat that way until nearly dawn, saying almost nothing for most of that time. Augie Farrow didn't fall in a single night, and there were no gunshots in this story, and no one ever found him anywhere. What brought him down was a class action lawsuit filed in the fall of that year, in the names of 411 families from Providence and the surrounding towns. Families whose names had been written inside that leather-bound ledger, by hand, one line at a time. Over many years, there was the elderly woman who sold flowers on the corner of Knight Street. There was the man who repaired cars for all of Olneyville. There was the elderly woman who always sat in the fourth pew on the left at St. Bartholomew Church. The woman Rosalie Santangelo had tried to help one September afternoon, and she lived long enough to see her own name included among the plaintiffs. When everything was over, the court ruled that hundreds of debts that had been paid off years earlier had continued to be collected, and Pharaoh lost everything he had, lost it through paperwork, in broad daylight, in front of the very people whose money he had taken for 11 years. 14 months after the morning he reported to serve his sentence, Emilio Santangelo walked out through the gate, and Delia Kavanagh was waiting for him in the parking lot beside her old car. She didn't hug him right away. She handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. He opened it there in the middle of the parking lot, and inside was an old tin that had once held cigars, and inside that tin were Owen's baptism ribbon, and the only photograph anyone had ever taken of the little boy, the photograph from the hospital on the day he was born. Both were intact. Emilio stood there holding the tin in his hands and asked her how she had gotten them back. Delia didn't answer. She only closed the lid for him and said they should go home. The little girl was waiting. She didn't answer that question that day, didn't answer it on any day afterward, didn't answer it through all 40 years of their life together, and Emilio asked exactly one more time, and then never asked again, because he came to understand that there are gifts a person is only allowed to receive, not open up to see what lies behind them. They were married the following May at St. Bartholomew Church, with Father Bruno Cavallo officiating. Delia didn't wear borrowed clothes, and she didn't come in through the back door. Sabina walked ahead of her, 10 years old, and when it came time to read the names of the two people before the whole church, the little girl read them clearly, without stumbling, her voice carrying all the way to the last pew, and many people in that church cried that day without quite understanding why they were crying, because they had only heard bits and pieces about the Santangelo girl, and had never once heard her speak. That fall, Delia opened a free evening class in the rectory basement for the children of working families in the neighborhood, 3 nights a week, and 3 years later that class had become a small school, with 4 classrooms and 6 teachers, and on the sign by the entrance was the name Rosalie Santangelo. Emilio baked bread in the family bakery until he grew old, and for many years afterward there were still people in Federal Hill who lowered their voices when they passed that bakery. But the reason had changed. They had 2 more children, and Sabina grew up in that house with 2 mothers, one in heaven and one who had arrived in the rain and stayed, and she spoke of both of them in an ordinary voice, and that was one of the kindest things a child could ever be given. On top of the wardrobe, in the couple's bedroom, for all those years, there was always a cardboard box with one corner crushed, and no one in the family ever explained it to guests. There are moments when people become certain they have nothing left, so certain that they can no longer see that the one thing still remaining in their hands may be the very thing another starving soul has been waiting for. Delia Kavanagh came to Federal Hill on a rainy night with empty hands, carrying only an empty cardboard box and a speech of apology she would never use, and it turned out that what she carried with her was the one thing all of Emilio Santangelo's money and power couldn't buy anywhere in this city. The human heart isn't a glass that becomes full and has no room left. It is a house, and a house can always have one more room built onto it. If someday a small hand slips into yours in the middle of the rain, please hold on to it, because it may very well be the rest of your life arriving in disguise. If tonight's story touched you even a little, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so that every day we can have more kind stories to sit together and listen to. We would truly love to know how you feel about Delia and about the house on Atwell Street. Which part of the story made you pause the longest? And if you have ever met someone who walked into your life at the exact moment you thought you had nothing left, please tell us about them in the comments, because we sincerely want to hear what is in your hearts. We wish everyone listening to this story good health, joyful days, peace, and a lighter heart beside the people you love. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the final line. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.